The morning began not with birdsong, but with the sharp groan of timber bracing against stone siege towers dragged through thick mud, wheels splintering under the strain of war. Smoke curled low over the horizon like a veil of mourning, the scent of pine, resin, and sweat heavy in the air. In the distance, church bells had long fallen silent, their copper tongues stilled by fear or fire. The walls of the castle, once whitewashed and clean, now wore a cloak of ash and soot, by ballista bolts and firepots hurled night after night. Behind those battered walls were not only soldiers, but bakers, midwives, and children clutching their mothers in the dark, each breath measured, each ration weighed with trembling hands. A boy no older than 12 held a rusted dagger in shaking fists, his lips chapped from thirst, his tunic stiff with dried broth that had once passed for stew. Outside the gates, an army of hardened mercenaries waited beneath fluttering banners, the wind snapping them like warnings. Some bore emblems of wolves, others a blackened son's age house, drawn into a game of blood and pride. Food had run out days ago. Cats, dogs, even candle wax had been scraped from the walls for one last taste of something warm. The dead were stacked like cordwood, and still no terms came. This was not a siege of strategy, but of starvation, silence, and slow unraveling. No horns sounded a charge. The cruelest part was the waiting an invisible noose tightening around the city's soul. And in the stillness, as frost crept along the iron bars of the gate, one could feel history itself holding its breath. The madness had only just begun. A single raven circled overhead as dawn bled pale light over the walls of Beziers below. The land lay scarred, wheat fields trampled to dirt, wells poisoned, and broken helmets half buried in the soil like forgotten prayers. The wind carried with it the iron scent of blood and the sour rot of horses left too long beneath the sun. Inside the city, word spread in whispers. The Crusaders were coming, and they bore not banners of mercy, but of flame and wrath. The people, heretics, believers, bakers, monks gathered in churches and cellars, some clutching rosaries, others weeping over bread that would not feed them all. Outside, a papal legate stood beside the siege engines, his white vestments muddied from the road, eyes narrowed toward the battlements. When asked how to separate the faithful from the damned, he answered only, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Soon, the sound of siege drums began a rhythm like the heartbeat of a beast too large to see. Fires were lit, oil was boiled, doors were barricaded, not just with wood, but with furniture, books, and the weight of desperate faith. There was no plan, no hope of reinforcement. In the chapel of St. Mary, a girl of 13 traced her fingers over the carved face of the Virgin, her palms still sticky with melted tallow. She prayed not for survival, but for her mother to die quickly, if it came to that. When the gates finally splintered, it wasn't an army that entered, it was chaos, cloaked in steel and soaked in scripture. Screams rose like psalms twisted, backwards, and the river ran red long after the banners were lowered. The siege of Beziers was not a battle, it was a ritual, and in its aftermath, only ashes remembered names. The first stone struck the city wall just after Vespers. It landed, with a thud that shook dust from chapel rafters, cracking a fresco of St. Sebastian clean through the chest. The townsfolk of Rochester had seen sieges before, but this one, whispered to be commanded by a king himself, carried with it a weight that seeped into bone. Outside the keep, King John's army had set camp torches lined like teeth in the earth, tents bristling with spears, and carts laden not with provisions, but with lime, tar, and bone hooks. Inside, the garrison prayed. They sealed shutters with iron, rationed wine and salted pork, and waited for the next stone. But what followed was worse than any boulder: silence. A silence heavy enough to hear the creak of winches and the distant clink of chains. The attackers were digging. Beneath the castle walls, sappers worked by torchlight smearing boar fat on timbers to slide deeper beneath the earth. The air in the tunnels was thick with soot and panic. Eventually, the mine was lit. A roar of flame surged upward, and the tower crumbled like parchment soaked in rain. Above the wreckage, the survivors fought on bowstrings snapped from overuse. Arrows were reshaped from splintered chairs, and chamber pots hurled like holy weapons. But they were running out of food, of hope, of reasons. One night, leg broken and wrapped in linen stained black, whispered psalms while sharpening a blade dulled from stone. In the quiet after the breach, he kissed a ring tied around his neck, for glory, but for the memory of a woman who once lit candles for him each night. This was not merely a siege, it was a confession, forced one day at a time, until stone could no longer bear the weight of defiance. Snow fell without sound across the fields of Novgorod, softening the scars of war and silencing the dead. But beneath that gentle white veil was a truth too bitter to name. The Teutonic Knights had come, cloaked in white crosses, bringing with them fire, sword, and a coldness deeper than the frost. From behind the city walls, defenders gazed out at the frozen lake that separated them. From the invaders, children clutched pieces of charcoal in their fists, drawing saints on the stones. Women boiled leather and parchment to make broth, the bitter steam rising like incense. In the cathedral, monks chanted through cracked lips, their voices hoarse, With fear and fasting, Prince Alexander stood in his fur-lined cloak, silent as his men prepared not just for battle, but for sacrifice. They would fight not for land, but for soul, for the right to pray in their tongue, to bury their dead in blessed ground. The enemy did not shout. They moved like ghosts, with disciplined precision. Their banners never sagged, their swords never rested, and when they came marching across the ice, they looked like a prophecy from Revelation. What followed would be remembered not for its scale, but for its silence. Steel clashed against faith, and blood stained the ice, like wine spilled. At a ruined altar, one girl, hidden in the bell tower, recorded the toll of each hour, even as arrows shattered the stone beside her. Her fingers bled, but she kept the count, not for victory, but so the world would know they were there. In Novgorod, the siege was more than war. It was a question: can a people hold their breath long enough to keep their soul intact? Rain slicked the stone steps of Montségur, the fortress rising like a relic from the spine of the Pyrenees. Inside its walls, Cathar heretics prayed in whispers, their hymns laced with dread. Outside, a crusader army gathered, sent not by a foreign king, but by Rome itself, determined to extinguish a flame they feared too much to understand. The defenders were for peasants, carpenters, midwives who believed the world was ruled by dual spirits of light and dark. They had no real weapons, only boughs carved from elderwood and pikes reforged from farm tools. But they believed, and belief, when cornered, becomes dangerous. Snow crept into the bones of the old walls, and candles burned low in their sconces. A child coughed in the hall of arms. Her mother wrapped her in a cloak once worn at her wedding. Still, they refused to surrender. To kneel meant recantation. To recant meant a death of the soul. The siege dragged on into hunger, into sickness, into fevered dreams of burning fields and angels weeping blood, and still the banners of the papacy fluttered below. A final message was sent smuggled in a hollowed loaf of bread. It read only, "We will not betray the light." The final assault came with fire, not a battle, but a cleansing. The captured were given a choice: abandon their faith or enter the flames. More than 200 walked into the pyre without screams. To this day, the soil at Montségur grows wildflowers in spring, as if the earth remembers those who chose to die whole. This siege was not a clash of armies. It was a furnace of conviction. The siege began with laughter, the mocking kind that soldiers used to hide their hunger. For over a month, the defenders of the fortress at Chios had watched the Ottoman fleet anchor just beyond reach, their ships sleek as daggers and painted with eyes. Inside the fortress, water was rationed by spoonfuls, bread was gone, salted meat, gone. They boiled olive pits, chewed parchment, drank vinegar. Still, they sang. Greek hymns echoed across the stone, voices cracking under strain, but holding. The walls were thick, Roman-built and ancient, but the cannons were new. Every morning, the thunder began again, shaking icons from chapel walls and dust from the rafters. One priest continued mass, even as a blast shattered the eastern apse. His hand never wavered. Below, in the granary, a widow tended to the wounded. She used wine as antiseptic, linen torn from wedding dresses as bandages. One boy, blind in one eye, shivering, refused to cry. His father had told him that weeping was for when peace returned. Not now. The Ottoman commander sent messages of mercy, surrender, and live, they wrote. But the defenders sent only silence. They chose not to answer at all. When the breach came, it was through a sewer tunnel. Men emerged like rats, blades drawn. The defenders pushed back with torch and blade, the stink of burning flesh mingling with incense still thick in the chapel. This siege ended in fire, and in the sound of bells tolling madly as the walls crumbled. But for a brief moment, amid the ruin, it was clear they had made the invaders work for every stone. The soul of Chios had not been taken, only buried. The hills around Kenilworth were lush and green, fed by summer rains that disguised the coming cruelty. 1,000 men camped in those fields, archers, masons. Knights bearing the crest of the English crown gathered not to fight a foreign enemy, but to punish their own. Inside the castle, rebels loyal to Simon de Montfort braced for judgment. The king's wrath had been kindled by betrayal, and it would be quenched only by submission or starvation. The siege would last not days, but months, longer than any in England's history. The moat, wide as a river, glistened with algae and debris. Beyond it, trebuchets creaked under constant strain. The defenders answered with crossbow bolts and boiling pitch, but they knew this was not sustainable. Inside, rats multiplied, bread vanished, and barrels of ale were rationed like relics. They burned furniture for warmth, lit rushlights with strands of hair. The chapel remained lit, even in despair. Psalms were whispered, not sung. One knight, fevered and dying, asked only to be carried once more to the battlements, to see the sky. The king offered terms: surrender and live. The rebels refused, not from pride but from memory of oaths sworn in halls now ash, of men buried without rights, of justice they believed had fled the crown. Time passed, rain returned, disease took root, yet still the banners of rebellion fluttered, soaked but unbowed. When the gates opened at last, it was not from defeat, but from endurance. Emaciated, hollow-eyed, they emerged not as victors, but as men who had endured the wrath of kings and lived to speak of it. Kenilworth was not a triumph, it was a testament, and its stones still whisper of a siege, born not from glory, but from grief.